It feels like a dream come true to see Netflix producing another anthology series. Love, Death and Robots has a lot going for it. There's a huge amount of variety to be found in these 18 short films, whilst keeping to the three core themes of romance, demise, and technology. The cherry on the cake being that it's all, with one particular exception, animated. The show acts as an exhibition of what computer animators are capable of in 2019, not only in terms of realism but creativity too. At the head of the table is Tim Miller. His upbringing in the late 70s was heavily influenced by a comic book series titled Heavy Metal. These science fiction / fantasy / erotic comics stood out for essentially being anthological, with different short stories being written and drawn by different people in each issue. The rights to a film version of the comic became a reality, and ABC News reported in 2008 that David Fincher, director of Fight Club and later The Social Network, would be creating a part of the Heavy Metal project with Blur Studios providing the animation, the head of which is Tim Miller. Both of which would eventually become producers of this show, but unfortunately no studios would take the project on at the time. Miller is quoted in an IGN article saying that the idea of seeing Heavy Metal brought to life terrifies movie-making executives. These big industries are clearly more concerned with bringing families into cinemas instead of allowing creative freedom. Netflix being a whole different animal entirely, I was glad to see how much leeway the company gave to Miller's vision of the show. This intro should incentivize you to go and watch Love, Death and Robots if you haven't done so already. Otherwise, strap in, because it's time for me to analyze all 18 of these pieces of art and tell you if I thought the trip was worthy or not. The first episode acts simply as a prelude for what's to come. There's definitely an element of showboating the amazingly detailed and hyper-realistic animations studios can produce now. Sonny's edge is certainly nothing to go crazy about, but simultaneously it doesn't need to be. Going into this one, I was reminded of Robert Zemeckis' film Beowulf, which was released about 10 years ago, but was also entirely animated for adult audiences. Well, it got a 12A certificate, so take what you will from that. There's no holding back on the swears, the violence or nudity in Love, Death and Robots. I particularly liked how sex was used as a weapon in this violent scenario that's laid out before us in this episode. The opposing fighter's phrase, "you're going down," and subsequent hand actions are a good example of this. There was also a nice theme of revenge resonating through this one too, as though this one fight was just the start of a female uprising in this patriarchal world that had done her so much wrong in her life. This is shown through the stylistic choices of the episode, such as making the protagonist's monster nimble and flexible instead of a rigid, tough one like her opposition. It leads to a really painful moment where the monster gets stabbed particularly slowly, making the audience truly feel the attack. My only problem with this first episode is a general note about most of the episodes that are aiming for realism like this one, and it's to do with hair. I've always thought this with CGI, but hair is the one thing that has been rather slow to improve over time. They always seem to have too much flow or end up looking like straw. What I suspect happens is that the animators are instructed to make hair look sexy, and in the same vein, most of the females in this series are ridiculously attractive. This will become more apparent in later episodes, but this first episode definitely hooked me to watch more of them. I really liked this one. It was very humorous to see three robot tourists acting very humanly despite all the humans being dead. There are some gorgeous backdrops and locations that are explored in this episode. One that sticks out to me is when we see #We'reSoF***ed placed above a body, indicating that you won't have to take this episode particularly seriously. There's also an undercurrent of concern for futuristic intelligence that's scattered throughout the story. For example, the robots step on human skulls without hesitation, having no conception of life like we do. Later on, they find a games console that is essentially an early version of the tall robot, who throws it on the ground with the little orange one animating it like a puppet. The pyramid robot is designed really uniquely as well. I liked how it was able to transform in order to behave in a humanoid way, like sitting and dancing. There's some really good twists in the plot as well, like when they're all sitting on a couch, we, the audience, assume they're watching TV, but turns out to be a cat they're watching instead. This was some nice foreshadowing of the ending too, which was elegantly simple and left me feeling very satisfied by the end. We learn about these characters by their interactions with the environment, and by the end it's the environment that ends up interacting with them forever. This one is a stylistic masterpiece. The action didn't stop once. This dancer character who runs to her absent boss because she witnessed a murder happening across the street that she herself would ultimately be involved in. The whole thing feels like a dream or a drug trip of some kind. I'd go as far as to guess that what we see is this stripper's drug trip. Her inability to explain to the emergency services and the fact she goes to work despite believing she witnessed a murder prove this. A clue that also supports this theory is that her boss Vladimir is completely out of his mind on pills that are found inside his drawers. The entire journey contains psychedelic colors. In fact, the tints of the city are constantly changing with every shot. The camera frequently goes out of focus, and we're treated to single frames so jaunting and colorful that are thrown in from time to time. Another aspect that really drew me in was how the camera would shake when characters run past them or when a character breathes close to one condensation appears. You get a sense of it being cold through costume as well. Our protagonist being very loosely clothed alongside all the other girls being swamped in leather suits and masks adds to this extremely visceral experience. There's a really nice detail that's added after the dance as well, where on a screen it flashes "It's my leash," juxtaposing sexual liberation with bondage. The episode looped back to the start as well, which I thought was really interesting. It made me wonder what the male's journey would be like compared to hers afterwards. Would he be doing the same sexy dance and be chased by a girl with terrible makeup? This episode did have a big impression on me. The only thing I was happy about with this one was the end. Our perception gets changed by that awesome zoom, and we see the planet is already overwhelmed by the monsters and that they're pretty much all doomed. I didn't think the characters were particularly interesting though. It was a fairly black and white tale, you know who's good and who's bad. The Titanfall-esque suits didn't really wow me either. It felt like a video game trailer, something Blur Studios coincidentally specialize in. As a game, this might have been pretty cool, but as a piece of media, it's fairly bland. Although now I think about it, I don't think this would make a good game either. The frame rate is all over the place. I don't know why the characters are animated at half the rate as everything else. This is most apparent and awkward to watch when Hank's fighting with the big monster. Sometimes if a quick action happens, more frames are dedicated to it, but it really ruins the flow of the story when it goes from being smooth to not smooth fairly consistently. We have our first instance in the series of eyeless monsters that don't seem to have any significance other than being bad. Give this one a miss if you can possibly help it. This one had more of a comic book vibe to it, but it didn't really deliver in any way. The art style is quite basic and also suffers from a lack of smooth animation that Suits also suffers from. The only thing is, this one's in 2D and that kind of makes it worse. It looks cheap. One particular example of this is when we see this little montage of the equipment the team have, just to make the audience aware they've got some C4. This story would have been better told if it was chronological. Right after this pointless opening scene, the kid assistant gets torn up by the monster. By dint of him not being in the opening, we knew he was going to die. His death was cool, but nothing was built up, so I just didn't care. Another problem with this one is that the monster itself required a lot of exposition. The old man nattering away and translating what the monster is saying just blows up the episode with crappy dialogue. Oh, speaking of crappy dialogue, I felt that the female soldier character was literally just a swears machine. She just throws around so many cats and f**k-offs throughout it that it just diminishes their impact. The cat's inclusion in this was just an excuse for sex as well. Not only does both the commander and his subordinate make pussy jokes, but the two cats literally have sex on the ceiling as well. If the cats were so essential to these people's survival, well, they did a really poor job at keeping them close just in case the big monster came back and consumed them. I actually really liked this one. It's the shortest one of the bunch, and I can imagine this being the kind of thing Miller was talking about in regards to YouTube-esque content. In the IGN article I cited earlier, Miller goes on to say that with things like YouTube and Snapchat, modern audiences are primed for short-form content, and in this regard I wouldn't be surprised if I just stumbled upon something like When the Yogurt Took Over on YouTube. It just gets so hilariously absurd, to the point that the yogurts leave humanity behind on Earth and and it's revealed that they just played us for fools the whole time. This made me really happy because the story played effectively on how slow to act humanity is. As the narrator says, human intellectual vanity would prevent us from following the path to glory 100%. The narration by Maurice LaMarche is really well performed, and funnily enough, LaMarche narrated the English dub of one of my favourite Studio Ghibli films, Pom Poko. There's some really effective uses of colour in this one too. Just before the story jumps 10 years into the future, images of the yogurt bowl flash between footage of the riots, and then suddenly the houses are white, the pavements are white, everyone's clothes are white. Just an excellent way of showing the progression visually instead of having a card with text pop up on screen. To top it all off, even the spaceships that leave Earth are shaped like yogurt pots. Quality ending. I think my favourite part of it all though is that the episode has nothing to do with love, death or robots at all, and was nice to see this one not relying on violence, bad language and sex. Well, apart from this. Now we can go on and on about how great this one looks aesthetically, but the main thing this episode suffers from is its story. It is like a giant walking sci-fi It's like a giant sci-fi cliche. I'm reminded of the episode Sirens in Red Dwarf and Sinbad, amongst other things. From the moment the woman arrived on the ship, I was thinking, don't trust her. It seemed too good to be true, and lo and behold, it was. I'll grant them one thing though. Just after they've jumped into space, we see a Virgin Mary statue floating around in front of the camera, warning the audience not to trust an over-nurturing and motherly figure. In fact, the hero archetype is spun around quite effectively in this episode. The protagonist would traditionally find a way of sorting out his issue, but he's so far gone in deep space that his reality is just in tatters, being fed these visions of normality by an alien creature and becoming absolutely helpless simultaneously. The sex scene, in my opinion, is kinda unnecessary, and the song playing underneath it is cringy as hell. But did you know they even had people in motion capture suits for this scene, alongside 45 people working on it in post? The hellscape we see is undoubtedly designed to stick in the mind though, giving the impression that this alien was taking care of these life forms for several years. Though this conclusion is suspect because of the protagonist reawakening and going through the same cycle again. Is this webbish nightmare just another trick by the simulation to prevent him from questioning his reality ever again? The context and locale is great in this one. The power struggle intrigued me and is a bit of a slow burner too. I think the story becomes 100 times more interesting when the automatons are introduced, especially by the end when the female transforms back into her spiritual form thanks to the progression of human technology. It's a shame that there isn't much character progression in our protagonist considering how much time passes in this story. He doesn't seem to age or change his clothes whatsoever. Most of the characters were really one-dimensional, and it honestly felt like an Eastern tale told by a Westerner. Don't get me wrong, this episode was animated in Korea and it looks splendid. On the other hand, it was written by an American, so we do have a bit of a clash of culture here, and it definitely shows. The British colonialists are all bad without question, and yet the male protagonist is just like, they oppress me, but I like trains. I'll bring your attention to an interjection with 4 posh guys trying to have their way with the female protagonist in the street. I really don't get how a short Asian guy could intimidate 4 blokes that are all taller than him. It gets even worse because it starts feeling like a superhero movie after Yan has had her whole body replaced with machinery. When the governor is about to punch her, she grabs his hand. And God, how many times have we seen this before? She's now been upgraded for his pleasure, which, don't get me wrong, was a great narrative idea. It's just a shame she just instantly decided enough was enough there and then, just for the sake of dramatic tension. The most effective moment of this episode was when we see her body getting cut up from her point of view. There's this feeling that spirituality and morality have been lost in the pursuit of profit and technology. Yeah, I have no idea why this one wasn't just thrown off the shelf in the preliminary stages of production. It starts off excellently with this suit coming to evict some yokel, which had me intrigued, but then it just derails into a sub-story about a monster that eats people. It gets so dull and off topic so quickly, and the suit doesn't get anywhere near the amount of screen time I would have liked him to have. I think on the one hand, the story has a well-intentioned message, but on the other, it just comes comes off as tacky and lazily conjured. There's some really crude uses of nudity in this one too that feel like they're just put in there for the sake of making it an 18. When the old man looks at a porno mag and starts being concerned for his doll, that was quite amusing. But in the flashback, his mate comes back from taking a leak without pulling his trousers up. We see his saggy, oversized on display. Just pull your damn trousers up, man! What makes even less sense is why the old man just suddenly becomes friends with this monster. It killed your only mate, and you're not terrified of the idea that he might eat you next? Support the channel on Patreon or get a YouTube Premium subscription, and one day, maybe I won't ever have to run ads on my channel again. By this point in the series, I think you can pretty much tell what kind of content is going to be included in each episode. There will be some nudity, there will be some needlessly inserted profanity, and there will be gore/violence of some kind. By episode 10, I became pretty desensitized to it all. When the protagonist goes to the site where his friend died, there's so much gore around him, but I just didn't react in any way. And of course, he had to be nude when confronting the big white wolf, didn't he? More to the point, what exactly is lovely and robotic about werewolves in Afghanistan? Oh, that's right, nothing! I would have preferred a dump. Sorry, let me try that again. I think I preferred the dump over this one, just because at least the animation in the dump has more flavor to it than the boring, ultra-realistic style we have to endure in this one. I say that, maybe attempted realism would be more accurate. I don't know what it is about the animation in this one, but most of the time I find the facial expressions of all the characters to be too similar or unbelievable. The voice work communicates most of the story in this one, but the CGI faces don't seem to express much emotion to correlate with this. The writing is absolutely dire wolf too. They barely set up two werewolf characters, both of which get bullied and berated by the other soldiers for being different or whatever, and even the general at one point makes a pass at them, which I didn't understand. All this makes no sense given how good killers they supposedly are. They describe all these things they can do/have done, and not a single aspect of it gets seen. It's just described in the dialogue. And then there's the episode's title. They're not really shapeshifters, they just get really hairy instead. The title got me hyped that we'd have to pay attention to a creature like a polymorph or something, and the ending? Jesus, what a joke. Nothing says I don't belong like walking away in the sunset with a body in your arms. This one I have more positive feelings towards, probably because of its simplicity. Having said that, there certainly are sprinklings of an intergalactic corporation involved in this tale. It gets even more alien when she screams inside her spacesuit, but on the outside it's silent. This one also feels like a bit of a parody of Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity, perhaps taking a jab at that ridiculous sequence with Sandra Bullock spraying herself around space with a fire extinguisher. This does make Helping Hand feel like a patchworked episode instead of something wholly original. However, the protagonist makes a genuine sacrifice in space when she tears her arm off, which she specifically references in the dialogue of the closing scene, which I really liked. Now, I'm not a physicist, so I don't know how accurate pulling out your arm and using it to slingshot yourself back to a ship would be, but the idea alone is great and is enough to hold up this little story. What a lovely contrast of being in the desert and then bearing witness to some gorgeous psychedelic fishes floating around. The use of colour in this one is just astounding. I liked that they weren't striving for realism in this one, considering how strange and mysterious this tale is. It does feel a bit like A Scanner Darkly in its animation style. The green sky and heat radiating off the ground later, transforming into that gorgeous blue seafoil platen, just looked amazing. All the visuals are great, but sadly we don't get much time to learn about our characters. There's a younger guy who's a bit skeptical, and his doddery old partner is far more chilled out about their predicament than he is. Now, all was going well until the young guy gets swept away by what he's experiencing. I thought it was a bit out of character for him to just unquestioningly go and swim with the fishes, but what makes it worse is the characters don't even have names.
Hey, hold on a second, boy. Hey, come back down here. Hey! Look! Behind you! Hey! Look out!
I can't feel sorry for characters if their dialogue is written so shoddily. So it's not like the desert was once an ocean, it's just that the whole planet at one point was probably underwater. Therefore, there are ghosts of fish everywhere. Fine, but if there was something particularly special about the location our protagonists landed themselves in, that would have made it more interesting to me. You also get the sense that something bad is going to happen to the young guy as soon as he starts getting attracted to the idea of being a fish ghost. If he hadn't had this strange change in his behavior, the shark killing him might have had more of an emotional impact for me. And of course, he just had to be nude. Gotta get that 18 rating, guys, am I right? You'd be hard-pressed to get me to say much about this one. I would have been more impressed if this wasn't filmed with motion capture. It makes the whole job a lot easier, sure, but recreating Samira Wiley from scratch would have been fascinating to me. I was struggling to remember anything about this one before watching it a second time, and there's good reason for it. There's nothing of real substance to this one at all, and I think the time restriction is the main factor to blame for this. You can't establish the relationship of two quote-unquote characters in a futuristic war zone without some preamble about why they're at war in the first place. They try and write it off as sorting out the colonies, which just isn't enough for me. There are a whole bunch of montages speeding our way through the process of the episode without giving us a chance to soak in anything. The enemies are once again eyeless bad guys, and with so much attention pressed into the non-existent relationship between a woman and her spaceship, it didn't exactly flourish in any way. If you want to see a genuine relationship between man and machine, go and watch CGP Grey's Tesla Road Trip and don't bother wasting your time with this episode. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if I saw this episode on Cartoon Network or Adult Swim. It has an interesting art style to bring alive an intensely deep story about a robot artist. It prods the notion of artistic taste by making a mockery of it. Huge interstellar paintings with bits of blue cropping up again and again. This blue represents the influence of the past on creation, and that the cyclical nature of life can never be avoided. In search for higher meaning and longevity, Zima realizes that perhaps it is better to exist with a single purpose instead of perpetually seeking it with greater intelligence. And so by transforming back into his earlier model, he can once again appreciate simplicity while simultaneously leaving behind a legacy of art for people to enjoy. I think this one has the most to say philosophically, posing the question of what art is to a machine. It even goes as far as to question the perfection of creation when the journalist travels over the ocean on Zima's planet that is entirely of his particular blue. Later on, a sunset would cast the sky a brilliant orange, the opposite color to this form of blue on the color spectrum. Even on Zima's planet of perfect blue, it cannot be perfect all the time, and thus he is befallen to the limitations of nature once again. So yeah, Zima Blue is definitely one of my favorites of the bunch.
Boom! Explosion!
This one I haven't got much to discuss really. It's quite the insignificant bit of fun, spoiled mainly by cringy dialogue and forgettable characters. I swear to God that the rookie character was based off the Scouts in Team Fortress 2, and more importantly, I have no idea what the group were aiming to get out of this train heist. I've watched the whole series twice over now, so this really testifies to how truly forgettable this one was. One other problem this episode suffers from is the frame rate issue again. Like the episode Suits, several of the characters feel clunky in their animation, and the style of the whole thing didn't really grab me either. I think this would have made a great section of a video game. This one has a really great setup and premise. What a strange anomaly to find a civilization forming and crumbling at hyperspeed inside an old fridge. The moment when the nuke hits really breaks this fantasy though, because whenever you add a sudden nuke to anything, it has some serious dramatic implications. I'll give them credit for the fact our two middle-class renters are more concerned with a pink-tinted face than a city getting bombed. They do start feeling responsible for the civilization after a while, despite being mere observers, which created good humour too. I am a bit mixed about the ending though. The other episodes are quite reliant on restarting the cycle in narrative terms, and I honestly would have been fine with them showing the monkeys eating the mammoth and leaving it there. This would be more substantial than what we're left with, which basically boils down to, haha, dinosaurs, biatch! This one felt quite like the What If Machine episode from Futurama. It would have made for a good infographics video on YouTube, but considering Love, Death and Robots insists on being adult at almost every step of the way, it feels a bit strange to have this one show up towards the end. It amused me in part, but it feels really bottom of the barrel ideas-wise and didn't seem to have much to say. I thought it was a bit weird that despite Hitler dying, World War II still took place in some of the alternate timelines. The episode gets pretty repetitive after a while, and the sexy scenario was just so cringy. I think if they'd consulted some history books though, I reckon some really funny and interesting ideas could have sprung up. I think the Russian jelly scenario was probably the funniest for me due to Russia playing a key part in World War II. Wait, what's that? That's the basis for the finale of Love, Death and Robots? You're kidding me, right? Oh god damn it! If any of these episodes feel similar to Beowulf, this one is probably the one that feels closest. I mean, god, what a bore. None of the characters had any significance, it just looked good. Literally, that is the only thing going for it. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure they put a ton of effort to get this episode looking the way it does. They even put a horse in a motion capture suit, for God's sake. But it really is just too much like a video game trailer to be considered artful to me. The geographic and historical context bear no connection to this outpour of monsters. It could have been set anywhere and it wouldn't have made any difference. I would have been far happier with humans being the enemy in all honesty, but instead it's just another horde of eyeless monsters. Whilst being far less intricate and interesting than the episode Good Hunting, it feels like another case of an Eastern story written by Westerners for Western audiences. Once again, I should also remark that The Secret War is produced by a Hungarian studio, but is also written by the same dude that wrote Good Hunting, so I can still argue that this clash of cultures to be existent. A great example of this is when the group find the body of a Russian, where the lieutenant says, "Cheka, secret police." I would have thought a Russian would know what the word Cheka means. It's literally a term for secret police in Russian that it would even be out of date for 1944. It's a tiny thing, but what makes the whole thing more irritating is that it's completely irrelevant to the story at hand. Only that this member of the secret police was involved in voodoo black magic, and that's why Russia's fighting a war on two fronts. This episode was a bit of a letdown for me. I was pretty psyched for this one when I first saw its description, but it just fell flat, being nothing more than screaming from the rooftops, "Look at what our computer animators can do." I was quite excited for this show initially, but I think they just need to hire some better writers. Don't get me wrong, I love that this show exists. Like any anthology series, I'm always lured into the next episode just to see what other ideas the showrunners come up with. When you consider the success of Black Mirror on Netflix, I reckon there's a lust for more anthological content on the platform. Getting Love, Death and Robots out now while season 5 of Black Mirror is slowly being crafted was probably a good decision. This kind of material is interesting for Netflix to dabble into, especially because shorter films normally get thrown to the bottom of the producer's pile, with feature-length movies and TV shows being at the top. I just think the show's insistence on being adult in content entirely has locked them into a mold they can't get out of, nullifying the impact of the adult elements. If I had to pick a favourite, I'd probably say The Witness. But what about you? What did you think of Love, Death and Robots? Leave a comment below or have a chat with us over on the Discord server, where we will continue this discussion.